فيكاس بوتا قائد تربوي يعمل في قطاعات التعليم والتنمية الدولية والتكنولوجيا. هو مؤسسة T4 التعليمية. قاد وأدار أكبر استطلاع عالمي لآراء المعلمين بعد جائحة كورونا. السيد فيكاس سيقود جلستنا الحوارية هذه حول بعض من تلك النتائج المهمة في استطلاعه، وسيشاركه في ذلك تربويين من الأردن ونيجيريا والمملكة المتحدة. نبيل.
Turning to technology, the world's largest teacher survey post-COVID-19, led by my colleague, Vikas Bota, who is a globally respected leader and driving force for much good in education, international development, as well as technology sectors. He is the founder of T4 Education. So let's listen to some of the important results of this survey from the UK, supported by the experience of educators from Nigeria and Jordan. Enjoy our first discussion panel. Please, Vikas.
Thank you so much, Nabila, and thank you for colleagues from QRTA for organizing this event. When we started thinking about, last year as to what are the winds of change that have swept through the global education sector, and the clear thing that everyone can see on our in the sector is the adoption of technology and tools as a way of ensuring education continuity. And so at the beginning of the year, we embarked on this process to understand further what had happened, and we put in place a report that Professor Sarah Hennessy, who is the research director of the Edtech Hub, which is headquartered in the UK, actually we spoke about this, and we thought, okay, wouldn't it be a great idea to actually understand the experience of teachers, the perceptions of teachers around the world? And little did we know at that time that we would end up with such a humongous data set from around the world. So this study that we want to present to you today is really an expression of all the 20-odd thousand teachers that took a very in-depth survey. Before I call on Sarah to actually present the findings, I also want to introduce Fولوی اوميکونلي. Fولوی is the CEO of Teach for Nigeria, and given your status in Nigeria and everything that you do, we'll be looking for you from you to have a commentary or at least a response to some of what you hear from Sarah. So I will come to you at the appropriate time. And of course, Asma Osama from Jordan, yourself as a teacher in your country, from the classroom, and you really are the only K-12 teacher today on this panel. We would love to have some of your thoughts as to what Sarah presents and whether this bears out in your reality or in your context. And so without further ado, I want to introduce a co-author of the Turn into Technology report, Professor Sarah Hennessy, Research Director for the Edtech Hub in London. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vikas, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be able to share the results of the survey that we jointly administered. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see the presentation. Is that displaying okay? Okay. So I'm just going to start by just telling you a little bit about the Edtech Hub, where I'm based. It's a consortium of 6 partners. I'm based at the University of Cambridge, and we are one of the partners, working with other colleagues around the world. It's a long-term program funded by the UK government, and our aim is to undertake and collate and commission rigorous research to improve the evidence base for using educational technology, EdTech, to raise outcomes for all learners, particularly in low and middle income countries, and particularly the most marginalized learners. And we are working in partnership with World Bank and the Gates Foundation, as well as FCDO UK, and focusing on what's scalable, what's sustainable, and what's culturally appropriate and cost effective. So I think that the survey results that we're going to present today fit really neatly with the Hub's work, and we're very pleased to be able to draw on those findings. And just to say that we take a critical approach to EdTech in our work. We're not mesmerized by shiny new tools, but we want to look at what added value there is. And I think that's something that teachers probably also want to do. The hub focuses on 5 areas at the moment, and the use of technology to support individualized, personalized learning, girls' education, teacher professional development, pupils' participation in school, particularly through social messaging, and then using data, especially large data sets, to drive decision-making. Teacher professional development, the one in the middle, is where we're firmly located today in this presentation. And my own work is in that area. Teachers, of course, are pivotal in any education system, and the quality of education and learner attainment outcomes is going to depend on them and how they're addressing learners' diverse needs. So developing teachers' knowledge and skills is particularly important, and the global pandemic has thrown this into sharp relief. So the survey set out to investigate what teachers thought about it all. And as Vikas mentioned at the beginning, the survey was carried out by T4 Education in partnership with the team at the Hub. So thank you very much to Vikas and the T4 team, and also to my Hub colleagues, Salim, Adam, and Asma, who worked with me on this. This is what we think is the largest global study of educators' experiences during the pandemic. And the focus was on teachers' access and use of technology for teaching and learning during the pandemic, on learning losses of students, and on teacher professional development and teachers' needs going forward. The survey went out in 18 languages, and as Vikas mentioned at the beginning, we got over 20,000 responses, which was very pleasing. Almost 3/4 of those were from government schools, and there were differences according to countries as well as to where they were located. I'll just show you an overview there on the map. We actually, the responses came from 165 countries, which was pretty impressive. But they were concentrated in some areas. East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia in particular had high numbers of respondents. And certain countries were very highly represented as well. The Philippines in particular, we had over 7,000 responses from the Philippines alone. India, we had over 3,000. So we weighted the findings by region. We had, for interest, we had 307 responses from Jordan. So Jordan was also featured. And I'm going to interrupt my presentation very briefly to ask you a question, which I'm going to come back to during my presentation, to see what you think as an audience. Which teachers do you think, which ones do you imagine, made most use of technology during the pandemic? So teachers who had less than 2 years experience, 3 to 5 years, and so on. If we could launch the poll now, please, and if everybody could choose one answer, that would be great. Thanks very much. Okay, I will leave you to do that while I continue. Okay, so turning first to the first section of findings, on the impact on learning loss of students is what we'll begin with. And what we found was that learners with less access to the internet or to technology were most likely to be reported. And that was over 60% of teachers thought that as having suffered learning loss, but also those from financially insecure households and those whose parents were unable to support their home learning were also mentioned. Also those who had low levels of attainment before the pandemic. So it seems that the pandemic has discriminated to some extent in terms of technology access and has basically increased the digital divide along these lines. We did notice that contacting learners and also parents and caregivers through messaging, like social media, text and WhatsApp in particular, was very prevalent. Actually, 50 to 60% of teachers mentioned that, including in rural areas, which of course makes sense where the internet is unavailable. So which learners in particular did we find were mentioned? In terms of girls, we found that actually the majority of teachers didn't feel that girls' learning had been adversely affected more than boys. It was 60%. It doesn't, of course, mean that we don't need to prioritize girls' education as being critical, but it does mean that perhaps on a sort of inherently inequitable playing field, at least the pandemic impact didn't discriminate between the sexes. However, that actually varied a little bit by country. It was the percentages were higher in certain countries, in particular India. These countries represented are the ones in the survey that gave us more than 1,000 responses. That's why we've chosen those. You can see India is significantly above the global average, which is the first figure of 16%, and the other countries that were analysed for these two questions. The figures for Jordan, by the way, were similar to the average across the world for more learning loss in girls. It was 18% of teachers mentioned it. But more teachers in Jordan, 21% compared to the 14% average, said that parents prioritize boys' learning than in other countries on average. So there was a slightly concerning finding there. And here we looked at if the students haven't progressed, in what ways have they been impacted? And around 3/4 of teachers, as you can see, mentioned these 6 outcomes the most often. So these outcomes are predominantly focused on basic skills, so literacy and numeracy, and also on motivation to learn. So pupils' participation, paying attention in lessons, and so on. Those 6 findings are all kind of converging around those themes. But student confidence and well-being wasn't far behind, actually. Okay, I hope you've all had time to vote, and now hopefully somebody could display the poll results for us, and we can find out which teachers you thought made most use of technology during the pandemic. Okay, so the highest one is teachers with 6 to 10 years experience, followed by teachers with 3 to 5 and 11 to 20, fairly equal. That's very interesting. Thank you everybody for voting. Let's see what really happened. So actually it was the more experienced teachers, those with 21 to 30 years experience, who made most use of technology during the pandemic. So actually not any of those 3 groups that came out highest in the poll. And 55% of teachers globally were teaching lessons online, compared to only 38% of teachers who had 3 to 5 years experience. And almost half, 48% of this group of teachers with 21 to 30 years experience use their school's VLE, their virtual learning platform, to share materials with students, compared to only 31% who taught for less than 2 years. Again, I'll give you the figures for Jordan, just for those of you who are located there. The figure was 46%, not 55%, so it's a bit lower, but that's still significantly more than the 3 to 5 year group, which was only 25%, and actually 0 for the newly qualified teachers in Jordan. So what could explain this finding? We reckon that these experienced teachers probably by now had a very good grasp of the craft of teaching. They were probably more able to adapt their practices to harness the use of technology, but it would be good to hear other opinions when we come to the discussion side, because we're not entirely sure what explains it, of course. We're only speculating. We also found that there was a difference in the types of school in terms of which teachers were using technology and especially working online, with connectivity rates in public or state schools much lower than in the private sector. Obviously, the sort of the usage model of technology had to adapt. So you can see private schools at the far, the top end at 71% of teachers working online, and then public schools. But actually low-cost private schools made less use of technology than state-funded government schools, which was interesting. City schools, urban schools had more use of technology than the town schools and then the rural schools, as you might predict. And I think these findings raise some significant concerns around equity of learning opportunity. We also looked at subject areas, and interestingly, we found that mathematics teachers used digital technology for learning less than teachers in other core subjects, and particularly in some areas, so teaching classes online, sharing materials with learners using a learning platform, a school platform, sharing lessons by email and that kind of thing. Again, an interesting finding that perhaps people might like to speculate about why. We haven't got to the bottom of that one. So, sorry, I forgot to put that one up. It just gives a little bit more detail around what I just said. Okay, we're going to turn now to professional development, which was the second main area of concern on the survey. And finding that actually the amount of professional development that teachers had during the previous year, and this survey was carried out in April or May of this year, so it was basically the first year of the pandemic and school closures that was covered by the survey period. 42% of the teachers responding had 10 or more days worth of professional development, which is actually higher than the OECD average annually. So it was pretty impressive. We also found that the older and more experienced teachers completed more professional development on average than their younger counterparts as well. And what were they doing in that professional development? It focused on technology usage. As you can see, over half were having professional development on using tools for online teaching or remote learning and teaching, and on pedagogy around that as well. Working with peers in online communities of practice was another highly common response. And then moving down to safe online behavior and learner safeguarding as well. Although it seems to us that the frequency of the sort of the safeguarding training and also how to assess students' progress using technology for assessment were quite low, bearing in mind the challenges faced with online learning, perhaps. So that's what that's what the professional development around technology focused on. What do teachers say they actually still need? Over half of them prioritized the need for developing their skills and competence in using technology. So they wanted more professional development around the areas that they'd already mentioned had been the highest amount. It clearly wasn't enough, even at the 10 days. The second highest need was teaching online, again, very closely related. And these two came out ahead of a host of all different kinds of needs, such as general pedagogy and teachers' mental health and well-being, although quite a proportion, 39%, reported that their well-being had suffered during the pandemic. But it seemed like they wanted to focus primarily on how to integrate technology into teaching. We asked them what they thought government should do after the COVID pandemic to address learners' learning loss. And 45% of them mentioned support teacher development. So that was the top need. The next one was supporting their well-being, and then again, providing training for integrating technology, providing materials for technology, and providing access and devices for marginalized students. So those were the top 5. And then what should schools do to help learners catch up was another key question. Here, a very different picture emerged because it was focused on learners' needs this time, both the question and the responses. And we found that 2/3 of the teachers believed that supporting learner self-regulation and their understanding of how to learn should be priority actions, which was very interesting. In fact, recent meta-analyses of evidence by Hattie and by the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit in the UK, just published in 2021, show that self-regulation is a top factor in pupil attainment. So it was interesting that teachers recognized this and wanted support for their learners on that. They also, over half, wanted to give learners more time to practice and reflect rather than direct instruction, which is related to the first finding, of course, with the independent learning. Then engaging parents and caregivers more often, introducing more play in learning to reduce stress was an interesting one, and more peer learning and interaction, both in the classroom and remotely using technology. So those again were the top 5. So overall, we found that actually teachers were very resilient. They felt that the pandemic had made them better teachers. 86% said that the experience of teaching during the pandemic, the challenges they faced and the way that they tackled them had made them a better teacher. And half of them were more enthusiastic about teaching than they had been beforehand, with only 22% becoming less enthusiastic. So these are the kind of the most positive survey findings. We were very pleased to see these. You know, we can conclude that teachers faced enormous difficulties, but they were pretty enthusiastic about the new skills that they developed. They actually we also found they decided to stay in the profession for longer than they'd planned, and basically they rose to the challenge in the face of what we could say is, you know, generation-defining adversity that they had to face. They upskilled themselves, they got to grips with technology, and they are still eager to integrate it into learning in the classroom and teaching. They're keen for more professional development to include support on pedagogies for digital instruction. So just a summary there of the key findings that I've been mentioning. With the first one, I think the pandemic has taught us also that access to and use of technology, it has the potential to widen social divides and to further marginalize disadvantaged groups of children. But there was actually little emphasis on the needs of marginalized children or teachers in the survey. Teachers just did not focus on that, and their professional development did not focus on that. I've already mentioned that the older, more experienced teachers both used technology more, but also undertook more PD, more professional development. They've upskilled themselves, as just mentioned, supporting learners to self-regulate, using consumer messaging platforms with students, and the lack of focus on assessment probably warrants some further investigation, as does the finding for the maths teachers using digital tools less. We're not entirely sure why. So in sum, teachers have spoken and given us some clear indications of their needs concerning technology provision and teacher professional development. And now it's up to policymakers, educators, and other stakeholders to listen to their voices and see what we can do going forward. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. And, you know, we've had quite an incredible audience today of nearly 2,000 people watching and participating. So one of the things about this QRTA forum is they've had an enormous turnout, which I would like to congratulate them for. Now, when it comes to our next speaker, and the reason why I was keen to invite Folawe onto this conversation is when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN put in place in 2015, Development Goal number 4, which is on quality education, really requires us to up the pressure and the temperature when it comes to, you know, when it comes to quality outcomes in places like Nigeria, as being one of the most biggest countries in the whole of Africa, with such a population and almost 2 million teachers in your system. Folawe, can I ask you a question in terms of what do you find counterintuitive with regards to the findings of the report? And maybe we can spend 5 minutes talking about that at this stage, and then I'll come to you, Asma.
Thank you very much, Vikas, and thank you so much, Professor Sarah, you know, for presenting that. And Vikas, before I go into what I found, you know, to be counterintuitive, I just wanted to share, first of all, that, you know, as a country, what we experienced, you know, getting into the pandemic was, you know, and over like an emphasized pandemic that already existed within our education system. And so just as the report showed, you know, we did suffer a digital divide across our schools, and particularly, you know, a lot of private schools were better positioned. Most private schools were better positioned to continue learning for students. And, you know, they had access to the technology, the infrastructure, you know, the tools and the skills to be able to transition. But then the public schools and the low-cost private schools did suffer because, you know, even with the public schools who had any access to computers or internet at all, the schools were closed and locked down for 7 to 9 months. And, you know, teachers couldn't access the computers. It was a full-on lockdown and couldn't use the monitors, you know, that were in school and all of that. So, you know, just to mention that, but what we found to be most interesting in Nigeria was that it was actually the young people. It was a lot of, you know, so, you know, it was really shocking to see the survey showing that, you know, more experienced teachers were able to, immediately transition and use technology to create content and lessons, for their students. But, in our case, the examples of the lessons and contents that were going around, were being developed by the younger teachers. And so it's such an interesting thing to see, but not to say that, the older teachers weren't getting trained, because that was one of the things that we see. And I agree with the report that resonates, with us here in Nigeria, that we actually saw an increase in the number of teachers, experienced teachers who were getting trained, unlike before, because, with training, you have to sort of cajole teachers or give, some sort of token here in Nigeria, especially with public school teachers. You have to give, an allowance to encourage teachers to go for training. But we saw the ease and just the, voluntary willingness, for teachers to just go ahead and get training. So I think for me, what I saw, that stood out and that was a bit shocking was just how, in other countries, older teachers were the ones who were transitioning, but here we had, a much different experience. And also even with the transitioning, because there wasn't the internet penetration across most of our schools, and neither was there, the technology penetration. We saw leverage of the radio and television, so low-cost technology platforms. And even with that, there had to be extra training to ensure that, it wasn't just the way that engagements were happening in the classroom, that it was happening, virtually, whether on radio and television as well. And with that, there wasn't, within, to the report as well, we also couldn't really assess, using technology. So assessment was literally only, through like some phone calls, dialing into the radio programs, and a lot of it was in real time as well. So there was that gap. And I'm speaking from a place of operating in rural communities and in low-cost communities. But then also from what I've seen, amongst colleagues share with the experience with private schools and with much privileged students and teachers as well.
So Folowe, when you see, for example, this report about the biggest inequality now being around the access to devices and connectivity, as opposed to other inequalities that we've often spoken about, firstly, you agree with that? And the second thing is, as it was, Nigeria was already struggling with regards to their SDG target. What do you think this does?
So Vikas, I was very hopeful. I was hopeful when the pandemic happened, and I was hopeful that this will be the wake-up call, for us to really invest, like I say, put our money where our mouth is and really, really invest radically and urgently in education. It's unfortunate, but I haven't seen that willingness. I haven't seen that investment translate, say, for example, our current budget, when we look at it, our current budget sits at 5.6% of our entire national budget. And so if we're going to be radically investing in ensuring that, we can get as many of our teachers, to have the infrastructure, to have the materials, to have the skills, to be able to engage, with a time like this where, yes, there's been learning loss, but also is, how do we ensure that we're cushioned and we're prepared for any other pandemic if it happens? We haven't seen that, because, and I think for me, it's really saying to our policymakers, our regulators and, our investors to really consider how we can ensure that teachers and students have access to technology. And Vikas, I'll just say, like, technology now, computers now, are like pen and paper in school. So it's not a whether or not, it has to be made available, to teachers and to students if we really want to, get the gains of investing in our human capital in Nigeria.
Thank you so much, Folowe, and really appreciate all of your leadership on this subject as well in such a critical place like Nigeria. Now we turn to Asma, but the thing, Asma, and I say this as a joke almost, which is the numbers have shot up since Folowe started speaking, because I know that people have come just to watch and hear you speak as being the Jordanian representative on this panel. Asma, from your classroom experience, what is it that you heard from Sarah that you think absolutely she's right in what she said? And also in terms of, tell us about the situation as a classroom teacher. As much as all of us are involved in education, there is no one more important in this panel as you. And so your perspective is really critical in terms of how we start thinking about giving teacher voice to this really important subject and try to understand it. So over to you.
Thank you, Vikas. Thank you, Professor Sarah. Hello, Folawi. Actually, our experience is almost the same. I'm going to talk as fast as I can. I'm going to talk about my experience as a teacher in my school, which is similar to other teachers in Jordan in changing to technology. As we all know, schools switch to not hybrid, but to remote learning in such a very short period. The pandemic period of the previous year brought into the surface some of the issues that we as teachers already facing in our career. The lockdown and the school closure forced us to adapt to new tools and new approaches. We have working tirelessly to communicate with our students to minimize learning losses as much as we can. In order to talk about changes to technology in this new normal, I have to emphasize how important is to keep communicating with our students, which allow them to feel like they are still at school with their teachers. And also allow us to follow up with our students and to give them a thorough feedback. So we had to use interactive applications and platforms. And from this point, I have to talk about our success in Jordan in distance learning. From day one of distance learning, we as teachers started to create WhatsApp groups with our students. After a few days, the Ministry of Education shooted lessons for all grades in all subjects. A few days later, they created an educational platform from zero. Of course, we had faced some challenges, such as most of the teachers have only one smartphone, and we have to remember that they also have kids at home to learn. Other challenges that most of the students didn't have their own devices. They had to use their parents' device. Also, I have to admit that as a government and as a Ministry of Education and as teachers, we did a great job in a very short period. Smart devices to some of the kingdom's schools and schools and universities students. Sometimes we had to buy internet units for our students so they can be able to attend the classes and to take the exams, to submit their homeworks. Now let me talk about what we did as teachers in both public and private schools. Of course, private schools has many tools that is much development than in public schools, but we tried our best. So we teach classes online using different apps such as Zoom and such as Microsoft Teams. We shared digital resources with our learners. We made the soft copies and worksheets and exams for them. We shared lessons tasks by WhatsApp, by educational platforms, by Google Classroom, and many different other tools. We recorded.
Can I, Asma, thank you for your really detailed response, and it's really great to see all the things that you did to pivot onto this remote learning format. You know, I want to. We have a shortage of time, so I want to. I want to bring Sarah back into this conversation. But before I do, and give you, Sarah, the concluding voice in terms of this conversation, and if there's something that you want the 2,000 participants of this seminar to do or think about, so please have a think about what that one final point is. I want to also talk about how I am fortunate and have the opportunity to serve on the board of the advisory board of the QRTA, and you know the work that you do is just so incredible in terms of capacity building of the teaching profession in your country in specific. but then the impact that you have globally. So I want to congratulate the team for hosting this. And now on that note, I come back to Sarah in terms of, well, what is the one thing that those that are watching should be aware of when it comes to the use of technology by teachers, especially in education?
Thanks, Vikas, and thanks to Asma and Folawi as well. They're really interesting responses to the survey, which, yeah, I was fascinated by. I think, well, just to really reiterate what we've all been converging on, which is that teachers are professionals, they are dedicated, they are creative, they are resilient, and they have done a fantastic job under very challenging circumstances during the pandemic, and that continues. The pandemic's not over, the challenge is not over. So I guess the message I'd like to give out is please recognize teachers for that, for what they've achieved so far, but really pay attention to the call that they've put out for what they want, what their needs are going forward. And I'm speaking to a whole range of stakeholders here, from governments down to fellow teachers and everybody who's involved in that educational mission. We know what teachers want now, and we need to think about ways to fund it and to make it happen.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Asma, and also to Folawi. It goes without saying, we all have our social media accounts and our organizations do. If you wish to have more information about the survey, you can go to www.t4.education, and there's a site there where you can go to T4 Insights and actually look at the survey for yourselves. On that note, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the next such forum where we can again participate and learn from each other. There is no more important task in education, in my opinion, than listening to teachers, because they are at the coalface and making sure that we're able to achieve our overall responsibilities and goals. So please do everything you can to strengthen the hand of the teacher in the classroom. Thank you so much, and goodbye.